Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jonathan Blaine. I'm from DFDL, and I'll be your moderator for today. We want to thank everyone for joining this third session of three sessions that we're holding, dealing with responding to uncertainties in Thailand under COVID and trying to remain resilient under COVID-19. As everyone's aware, COVID has been quite devastating economically over the last 18 months or so. This third session is going to focus mainly on real estate and real estate restructuring and potentially real estate insolvency. The first two, in case you weren't able to join us, were about workforce restructuring, and the second one was about debt restructuring. So you may want to find those online somewhere and have a watch if you missed those by any chance and you have an interest in them. What I want to do today is spend a few moments introducing the firm, and then move from there to introducing our guest speaker, Paul, who is who works out of our Bangkok office, even though he also works out of the has worked historically out of the Vietnam office, and we'll sort of talk about his background a little bit. And then we'll move into the content, and then after that we'll have a Q&A session. So if anybody on the floor has a question that they'd like to ask, if you can please click on the bubble with the question mark inside and provide your question. We'll be sure to try to address it as best we can. So the first thing I want to do is introduce the firm, DFDL, and I'm not sure if everybody knows us. I'm hoping a lot of you do, but for those who don't know us or those that need a bit of a refresher, as law firms go, we are ASEAN. We were founded in ASEAN, founded in Vientiane 25 years ago. And we've grown throughout the region, and we cover all of ASEAN, and we're actually to the point of being an ASEAN +1 because we have an office in Bangladesh also. So we're very frontier and very Southeast Asia committed, again with the addition of Bangladesh. We are a full service firm, so we provide the full range of corporate and other activities, banking, compliance, employment, etc. And then we also, in addition to all the offices we have around the region where we have local specialists practicing, we also have 5 additional desks. So we have a China desk, India desk, French desk, Japan desk, Korea desk, and these are all staffed by people who speak the language and or have worked in those particular countries or those particular environments. And so we're able to service clients from those perspectives as well. So what I want to do now is sort of move on from the introduction of the organization or of the firm to introduction of our guest speaker. And our guest speaker today is Paul Volodarsky. He's actually the head of our real estate the deputy head, I should say, of the real estate, giving you a little bit of a promotion there. He's the deputy head of our real estate and construction practice. And as I mentioned a moment ago, he wears the hat regionally to a large extent. He's based here in Bangkok. He spent quite a bit of time in Vietnam also, and does quite a bit of work still in the Vietnam space. Part of what he does also from regional real estate, etc., is going to be a big portion of that is not just investment real estate, but also hospitality and those kind of and that kind of industry. So they all sort of fall under that rubric. Okay, so Paul, I think if you're good to sort of drop us into the discussion, I think what I want to focus on first is what kind of legal changes have there been in Thailand that sort of affect restructuring or insolvency matters when it comes to the real estate sector. Some of them may have been previous to COVID, but if there are also some reforms or other issues that have come specifically because of COVID, if you could highlight those, that might be quite helpful.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the introduction. In terms of legal changes in Thailand, there were a number of changes that actually went into effect just before the COVID-19 crisis, which affected the restructuring in relation to Thai real estate. In particular, there was amendments to the Bankruptcy Act. There was also the passage of a new regulation covering basically a means of registering a mortgage over leased property, which is something that's relatively new. There's a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that already have this kind of concept of land use rights versus just leasing. in which those land use rights can be mortgaged, and that's something that recently came into effect just around the time that we were experiencing the COVID crisis. For the bankruptcy rules, these were additional types of secured creditors. So historically, secured creditors had been creditors that had registered their rights over particular assets of a company, but now they've also allowed for the securing of rights over the income of a company as another type of secured creditor. So these types of things have influenced how people look at commodifying their real estate assets in Thailand, especially from a restructuring perspective. The other issues that have come up post-COVID are more practical issues in terms of enforcement of mortgages for non-payment. So in Thailand, there has been, I would say, some efforts to avoid foreclosure of properties, both from a legal perspective and also from a political perspective during the COVID-19 crisis, which is ongoing in Thailand, as I'm sure our attendees are aware. And that has been something that we follow quite closely to see how that's going to ultimately develop. And I think that sums up some of the key legal changes that have occurred over the last year and a half relating to COVID-19, but also legal changes that came into effect prior to COVID-19 that affect this sector.
And with those modifications in mind, even separately, what kind of legal limitations are there that real estate developers going through like a restructuring exercise might face?
So if they're going through a restructuring exercise, the first issue is the ability to sell your assets. So if you're going through a restructuring and you're going through a bankruptcy, there's oftentimes a toll put on the sale of assets. There's even a Supreme Court decision in Thailand which says that the sale of land or property does not count as the normal course of business for a company going through a restructuring exercise. So that can severely affect the way that a rehabilitation is conducted by that company. The other limitations to think about is that, as in most jurisdictions, you don't have to file as an entity to go into bankruptcy yourself. You can be forced into bankruptcy proceedings by a creditor, in which case that limits your ability to then look at the assets that you have in order to try to satisfy those debts. If you've already got a bankruptcy proceeding in progress, if it hasn't been dismissed and you haven't gotten permission from the courts to sell off any assets, then you're going to be stuck with those assets and you may be forced to close down the company if you can't come up with a plan to pay back those creditors that have put you into a bankruptcy scenario. Another limitation is just going to be from a more practical perspective. If you're going through a legal restructuring of your company, you're oftentimes going to be subject to oversight, meaning that the board of directors of the entity is not going to be able to make independent decisions without getting sign off from the parties that are appointed to oversee the transactions. So for real estate in particular, that can become problematic, especially for instance, a real estate developer engaged in residential property. If you're going through a process of selling off your condominium units or a residential housing development, that could be severely limited by a rehabilitation proceeding. And we've seen a couple of companies over the last year that have gone through this process, and lots of potential buyers who have not been transferred ownership of their property now looking at how do they secure their rights against the assets and trying to get the assets that are complete to be transferred. This is something that can be quite tricky and then costly for a real estate developer that isn't aware of these restrictions or may be facing some uncertainty, even if they're not at the point of filing for a restructuring or rehabilitation exercise.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. Just to shift gears a little bit from sort of the technical background, curious as to what your on-the-ground intel is as far as whether we've seen a lot of activity, a lot of restructuring activity in the real estate sector, or what have you sort of, you're sort of in the front lines, as we say. So what kind of information have you been able to pull out of the markets?
So from our perspective, there's been a lot of restructuring exercises, not necessarily tied to an insolvency scenario. So a lot of entities have looked at the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to start look at refinancing their transactions, either restructuring how they're operating their entity, bringing in additional partners that may be looking at opportunities in the market that have opened up because of COVID-19. So we've seen a lot of activity in this space. With that said, there are also a lot of transactions that are more quiet, which are more related to a distressed scenario. So we have seen a number of, especially foreign investment, looking at opportunities because of distressed assets, especially affected sectors like hospitality, the industrial sector, residential, looking at opportunities and therefore looking at restructuring opportunities in Thailand. But we've also seen distressed developers that are just looking to offload assets in order to avoid an insolvency scenario. So you've seen from bigger companies to small companies are looking to offload existing assets to avoid an insolvency scenario simply because of the reduced tourism, the reduced investment in the market because of COVID.
On a separate point, we sort of didn't raise this in one of the questions, but what are valuations looking like? Is there any, are there good valuations, or is everything sort of being propped up?
So it depends on, when you say good valuations, I would say for who? Right. The valuations in the market are very different from 2019. But with that said, there is a huge disconnect between investor expectations and property owners that are looking to sell or otherwise restructure their real estate assets. So we see a very big difference between the expectations. There are more opportunities starting to come online. So for some properties which are now struggling into going into almost year 2 of the struggle, because in Thailand in particular, you had a lot of limitations coming in basically at the end of 2019. So you had some struggle in the residential real estate sector in 2019 that affected valuations. But for investors right now, I think we're still a little ways off if you're looking for the bottom of the market. For investors that are looking at opportunities and trying to get the best properties that are available now, it's probably a good time to start looking at the pricing. And what I would say is that oftentimes the price that you find from agencies are the price that the owner wants to present and may not necessarily represent the price that an owner may accept.
Okay, that's very helpful, because I know valuations have been a big issue, so it's very helpful to get some insight on that. As far as particular industries, have we seen any particular industries where real estate restructuring has been more focused?
So the industry that I think that's been most affected has been the residential real estate sector. And that's because they have more easily accessible assets that can be used to settle debts. So that's the industry that we've seen some insolvencies filed and some restructuring exercises being conducted. In the hospitality sector, there's a lot of interest, but there's still a big disconnect between owner expectations and investor expectations, as we just talked about. We haven't seen a lot of insolvency issues with hotels, at least at this point. And that I think is somewhat connected to, the willingness of banks to allow for financing to remain outstanding despite, being overdue, simply because the banks don't necessarily want to take over an asset which is either underperforming or is unlikely to perform in the near term.
Yeah, so this sort of addresses one of the questions, or one of the pre-questions we got from some people in the audience, or as the audience is. Do Thai banks tend to foreclose or tend to take over hotel assets? And I think you have a particular perspective on this.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily a palatable thing to do at the moment. So, hotel assets need to be maintained, on an ongoing basis. They have large amounts of staff. And under the current situation, I don't think that there is a near-term prospect of returning those hotel assets to profitability. With that said, there are potential opportunities looking at, for instance, the sandbox scenario in Phuket and Koh Samui that is likely to come into effect in the coming weeks. That may make these assets more interesting and therefore may put pressure on owners to start paying back on their outstanding debts.
Okay. If we can, shift gears again a little bit and, touch on sort of your practical expertise or your practical experience, what you're sort of seeing. It's not necessarily legal or statutory or market oriented, but just really practice kind of issues that real estate developers in Thailand will run into or may encounter, sort of the nuts and bolts kind of things that follow on the actual structuring process. So I'm wondering if you have any practical issues that they may face, like one or two or three that you've observed.
Sure. I think from a practical perspective, there's a lot of issues relating to the type of financing that's available to avoid an insolvency scenario. So I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that we've seen a lot of investors looking at the Thai market and not just looking at hospitality, but looking at the industrial sector, the residential real estate sector, to inject capital in order to get better acquisition rights over assets. So for one, if you're looking at residential real estate, you're somewhat limited by the foreign ownership restrictions. So for an investor that's looking to enter Thailand, for a residential real estate project, there is no specific promotional category that allows for a foreign investor to own the majority of a residential real estate company. That is a key issue. It also affects the way that you structure finance, because you have, for instance, limitations on the interest rate that may be applicable on that type of finance transaction, such as in Thailand, it's being 15% being the maximum interest rate that can be applied, whereas that may not be of interest to a foreign investor looking to provide bridge or mezzanine finance for a project. For hotel assets, it's important just understanding whether or not the hotel asset is Board of Investment promoted, in which case it may be open to foreign investment up to 100%, or if it's not BOI promoted, looking at the limited ownership restrictions that you could have in terms of trying to find that additional financing to avoid an insolvency scenario. And for industrial, it's much more open. A lot of industrial projects are much more open to foreign investment, and so it's still important to check to understand that industrial aspect and to understand the assets that are available for the sale. I think industrial real estate is something that's starting to pick up in Thailand as an early indicator of recovery, more so than the hospitality sector. I think for residential, it's been selling off existing stock and trying to avoid creating new debts. For industrial, it's the cost of industrial leases is dropping because of COVID, and therefore there's opportunities for investors that are looking to acquire industrial land and generate income from that kind of business, particularly logistics as part of the e-commerce developments in Thailand.
So actually, this sort of segues quite nicely into our sort of last topic, and that is what is our outlook for the sector for the remainder of the year? We're already half done, right, as of today, so we've got only 6 months left. So curious as to whether you can pull out your crystal ball and figure out what's going to happen from now until December.
Sure. I mean, I wish I could say for sure what was going to happen, but based on what we've seen so far this year, I think, we've seen a lot of increase of investment into Thailand, which was something that I was a bit surprised at, noting the COVID situation. So I'm expecting that as the sandbox scheme starts to open up, you'll start to see some return of tourism, which should be a big boon on the economy. And I think you'll see much more interest in moving in the industrial sector in Thailand. So I don't think that we'll see a lot of new start construction for residential. Same for office, because for office leasing, there just isn't as high of a demand. But for the industrial sector, I think that's going to be something that'll grow quite quickly in Thailand, especially with companies looking to diversify their assets. So we've seen a lot of that move to Vietnam, but I've been hearing increasing interest in also looking at different industrial estates, especially the eastern seaboard of Thailand.
Okay, that sort of comes to the end of sort of the formal presentation process and the discussion process. So we wanted to open it up to Q&A. As mentioned before, I think we had one question from Q&A, and that was about the Thai banks foreclosing on hotel properties, and obviously there's a little bit of resistance to wanting to do that because of the expense associated with that. And of course, banks are banks; they're not real estate. They're not hoteliers, right? So there's a bit of an intellectual challenge for most banks to try to manage a property. If they wanted to be in hotels, they'd be in hotels. But I think separately, another question we had is to what extent is non-payment of debt, and this is a really tough question, I think. To what extent can force majeure serve as an adequate defense to breach of contract under the debt? I guess it's a formalized way to say it, but to what extent can you rely on force majeure when you're not paying? And how much uptake is there in the courts and in other cases with allowing force majeure to be an adequate defense against the breach?
So I think for force majeure, it's a big question mark at the moment. We haven't seen too many cases going forward claiming force majeure as an excuse for non-payment of the debt for real estate properties. But of course, there's a lot of considerations that need to be addressed when looking at making a claim for force majeure. So making sure that you understand whether or not the force majeure event is the reason why you are not capable of performing under the contract. So it's not enough to just say, well, COVID. Of course, COVID has been a huge impact on business, but it isn't enough necessarily to be the justification for non-performance. So if you are capable of operating your business and COVID may have impacted that business, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is a force majeure event excusing your performance under the contract. So it'll be important to understand, for one, whether or not a pandemic is included in a force majeure clause. I think typically under the CCC it would be included, but that's something that could have been negotiated between the parties as to whether or not to accept that risk. The other aspect of it is just a matter of tying the event to the non-performance. So if that event is, if that non-performance is based upon, for instance, the government shutting down your business because of COVID, that may be a very strong argument to argue for a force majeure event. So if you're an industrial estate developer and you have, a number of tenants that can't pay their rent because the government has shut down their sites on the basis of a COVID outbreak, that may be considered a force majeure event. But not being able to bring in tourists, or at least tourists of a sufficient volume, might be difficult for a hospitality owner to claim as a force majeure event, because technically tourists can come to Thailand, except that the requirements to enter are now more onerous than they were before.
And actually, I think you and I were discussing this before, actually the hotels are able to qualify as quarantine hotels, right? So that gives them an option to actually make money in the process. So it's not like the hotels have been specifically told you must close, period, right? So they have another avenue. So again, justifying force majeure in that context may be a bit of a challenge. Yeah. Okay. I think we're coming up to the end of our session here. I think we're quite far into the time. So I just want to take a moment and thank Paul for taking time out of his day to come and present the information to us. I think, there's the opportunities, the formalized processes, and then the sort of on the ground practical things to be considered, I think are very useful and very helpful for everyone. For everyone who's here with us now, if you can do us a favor and provide us feedback by scanning the QR code and taking a few moments to take our survey. that would be greatly appreciated. Of course, we want to always improve our presentations, our topics, etc. So if there's any, if you can provide that feedback and then also provide any additional feedback, that would be much welcome. Separately, we have a publication that we've issued which collates the government initiatives and the support that are being granted by the government here in Thailand over time. We tend to update this periodically. Obviously, we don't update it for every single change because they're coming in thick and fast. But you know, a lot of the major government initiatives and support tend to be a little bit chunky. So when those are issued and when the reforms are put to table, we tend to update this so that you can have one convenient product or one convenient resource to be able to figure out what all the government initiatives are and the support that they're being provided by the government, etc. And with that, I think I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this session. Again, if you didn't attend session 1 and or session 2, my understanding is they will be available online in at least 1 or 2 or maybe 3 spaces at some point. So if you're interested in workforce restructuring or debt restructuring, then please go ahead and make use of those resources. And if you have any questions or any follow-up or anything that anybody in the firm can help you with, you know, please reach out to either Paul or myself or anybody in the firm, and we'll be either able to help you ourselves or definitely be able to redirect you toward a resource that will be able to help satisfy your needs and help you through the process. It's been a very challenging and difficult year and a half. It doesn't look like Thailand is going to get out of this hole anytime within the next couple of months. So, yeah, and the government support, you know, they're doing the best they can. I have to applaud them because they've actually done quite good in supporting a lot of businesses and minimizing some of the impact. But we'll see if they're able to weather the storm or if it takes over and then we end up with a whole bunch of real estate insolvencies and things like that on a go-forward basis. So with that being said, I think we're finished. Again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Greatly appreciate it.